My name is Wen Lee, and I am very excited to be introducing our next speaker, Professor Genevieve Bates. Professor Bates is an incoming assistant professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was previously an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia and a postdoctoral fellow with the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. She also received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, where she is from. Her research includes political violence and post-conflict politics, transitional justice, and human rights. She also has a background in criminal law. Before graduate school, she spent 3 years working for the U.S. Department of Justice in their Office of International Affairs. She has also looked at how threats from institutions like the International Criminal Court impact on-the-ground negotiations about justice and accountability. One fun fact about Professor Bates is that she's run a half marathon in 3 cities across 2 countries on both coasts of North America. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Bates for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Wenli. Okay, I'm really happy to be here. As Wenli just said, I am a political scientist. I study comparative politics and international relations and focus in particular on the topic that I'm going to cover today, which is transitional justice. So I look at accountability for human rights abuses, and I look at this both sort of in domestic political contexts and in the sort of international arena. I guess I should stop and actually ask, can everybody hear me? I'm very loud, but I'm going to try to make the mic work for us. Okay, today I'm going to sort of give an overview of what transitional justice is in all of its sort of messy details and try to explain a little bit about why both academics and those who actually sort of implement transitional justice policies care about it and why they do it. Okay. So, these photos are from France in sort of late 1944, early 1945, during the so-called Wild Purge. So in the weeks and months following the Allied liberation of France, sort of a wave of uncontrolled violence swept the country as people sought retribution for those who had collaborated with the Nazis and the Vichy regime. So on one side of this are the things that we might think about, things like sort of murder, but it also included the sort of shaving of the heads of women accused of so-called horizontal collaboration, women who had had affairs or were forced to do so with the Nazis. Some raw sort of stats here are that roughly 6,000 people were killed during the Wild Purge, and another 20,000 women had their heads shaved for this horizontal collaboration. Okay, flash forward 4 decades, 3 decades, however many decades. In 1975, longtime Spanish dictator Francisco Franco died of heart failure, and this ushered in Spain's transition to democracy after 40 years of dictatorship. In the aftermath, the political parties in Spain, both on the left and the right, made the decision to sort of put aside the horrors of the Spanish Civil War and the abuses committed during the Franco dictatorship in what has since come to be known as the Pact of Forgetting. So just 2 years later, Spanish Parliament codified this Pact of Forgetting by passing an amnesty law. Now, this amnesty law did some really great things. It released a bunch of political prisoners and allowed people who had been exiled to return to Spain. But it also sort of codified a commitment to never address the atrocities that had been committed over the 40 years prior to the Spanish transition to democracy. So the question I have for all of you is, based on just what you know coming into this talk, were either of these things transitional justice? just like a quick poll, was the wild purge in France transitional justice? Like, raise your hand if you think yes. Okay. What about the Pact of Forgetting in Spain? Raise your hand if you think that the Pact of Forgetting, or specifically the amnesty law passed in 1977, do you think it's an instance of transitional justice? You're like, yes? Raise your hand high. Okay. Okay, we've got some yeses, some maybes on Spain, but a solid no on France. Okay. Well, what is transitional justice? How would we know it when we see it? And why should any of us care? Well, let's start with just what is it? It's defined in a bunch of different ways, but I'm going to show you my favorite definition, which is still quite literally the Wikipedia definition. It defines transitional justice as a procedure to respond to massive human rights violations that implements judicial redress, political reforms in a region or country, and other measures in order to stop human rights abuses. So I love this definition because I think it's pretty clear and simple and straightforward. But regardless of what definition you use, at its core, transitional justice refers to sort of the policies and procedures that are implemented during and after periods of transition from states of political violence to peace, with our understanding of what political violence is to be broadly construed. And I'll explain a little bit what that means in just a few minutes. For most, transitional justice has come to sort of be associated with a particular set of policies, what we call transitional justice mechanisms. And I'm going to outline those policies in just a minute, but all of these mechanisms sort of have a purpose that falls into what I think of as sort of one of three broad categories. So this is kind of my personal definition of what transitional justice is up on the screen here, which is that these policies are implemented with a goal of doing one of a few things: holding perpetrators accountable for the things that they've done. This is what most of my research focuses on, but not all of it. There's also the goal of sort of providing support or rendering some kind of justice to victims of atrocities. And then the last is implementing a set of institutional reforms to ensure that these kinds of things don't happen again going forward. Okay, but what are specific transitional justice mechanisms that might have these kinds of goals in mind? Okay, the first and probably the most famous are criminal trials. Now, these can happen both in the international arena and in sort of domestic political contexts. So by far, I would say by far the most famous instance of transitional justice were the trials against the Nazis in Nuremberg in 1945 after the Allied victory in Europe. This is an instance of international transitional justice. It's sort of imposed by the Allied powers on Nazi Germany after the Allied victory. A sort of more recent, very recent, version of international transitional justice in the context of criminal trials was the establishment in 2002 of the International Criminal Court. So it is very much seen as sort of like the successor to the legacy of the Nuremberg trials. It is a permanent international criminal tribunal that is, at least in theory, designed to hold individual perpetrators of atrocities accountable for sort of the worst kinds of offenses. The worst of the worst meaning genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and most recently, the crime of aggression, which is, if people are interested, something we can talk about in the Q&A. But criminal trials can also happen in the domestic political context as it relates to transitional justice. Perhaps, again, one of the most famous examples was in Argentina in 1985 when this was after Argentina's transition to democracy from military dictatorship, when the members of the military junta that had run Argentina prior to the democratic transition were put on trial for, amongst other things, sort of overseeing a program that led to the murder and forced disappearance of thousands of people. Okay, so that is criminal trials. On the opposite end of the spectrum is amnesty, certainly formal amnesty. And so this can be both, on one hand, just a decision to do nothing. Most people don't consider that transitional justice, but there are things like formal amnesty policies that can do things like, again, release political prisoners, allow those who were previously exiled because of the dictatorship, if we're dealing with a dictatorship, to return home, and sort of other things like that. So sort of returning to our example from Spain in 1975, many, not all, but many transitional justice scholars and practitioners actually would consider the 1977 amnesty law in Spain a form of transitional justice, though many would disagree on how good of a form of transitional justice a formal amnesty is. Again, perhaps maybe the second most famous type of transitional justice. Oh, wait, nope, I'm sorry. I'm one ahead of where I'm supposed to be going next. So then there's vetting and lustration policies. Now, these have to do primarily with employment. And what vetting and lustration policies do is they essentially ensure that those who were, who either actively participated in the commission of atrocities or secretly helped those who participated in the commission of atrocities are removed from any positions of power in this sort of new peaceful or democratic state. An example comes from Poland in 1989, after the pacted transition from the communist dictatorship in Poland to democracy. They implemented what are called lustration policies, which were in particular in Poland, though these differed across a lot of post-communist Eastern Europe, were focused in particularly on politicians who were running for office in the new democracy, and focused on those politicians who may or may not have secretly collaborated with the communist secret police during the communist dictatorship. Now, again, these kinds of policies varied quite a bit across post-communist Eastern Europe. Some of them focused specifically on politicians. Some of them focused on the entire sort of state bureaucracy, including like public educators or judges or things like that, which is something we'll circle back to at sort of the end of this presentation. But vetting and lustration policies have been implemented all over the world and across time, far beyond just post-communist Eastern Europe. Okay, now we move to what is maybe the most second famous of transitional justice policies, truth commissions. And here I'm gonna actually read the formal definition of a truth commission. So truth commissions are quasi-judicial institutions aimed to advance accountability through comprehensive accounts of political violence. The most famous example of a truth commission is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established after South Africa's transition to democracy in the early 90s from the apartheid regime that existed prior. One of the big things that all truth commissions have is that they issue a final report. Now, that report may be public, it may not be. Often the goal is to ensure that they're public, with the idea of establishing some sort of comprehensive set of facts about what occurred during this period of political violence. Okay, so next we have reparations or victim compensation, and this is something that I think a lot of people have a sense of what it's about, but it is essentially about ensuring that those who were actually sort of subject to the commission of atrocities or fell victim in some way to these kinds of atrocities have some sort of restitution or receive some kind of compensation for the abuses that they suffered. An example here comes from Peru in 2003. So the Fujimori dictatorship in Peru was particularly abusive towards indigenous Peruvian communities. And in the wake of Peru's transition to democracy, the new democratic government in Peru implemented a system of community reparations programs. So what these were programs that could include everything from building new schools to community centers and projects targeted specifically at the indigenous Peruvian communities, with the goal being sort of supporting community development after the state had contributed to so much harm done to these communities. Next are sort of symbolic transitional justice projects, mechanisms. Memory projects are sort of a really common transitional justice program. And they're designed essentially to memorialize both the victims of these kinds of atrocities and to help ensure that people know that these kinds of things have occurred in the places where they've happened. So I have two examples up here. One comes from Chile, and is and I'm gonna have to read the name of it because I can only think of it in Spanish, the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile, which memorializes the victims of the military dictatorship, the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. The other example up here is from Rwanda in the late 90s and early 2000s. It's a very different style of memorialization, and it memorializes the victims of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. So while the Memory Project in Chile is a museum, it is sort of like a very curated project of memorialization. The memorialization efforts in Rwanda often were focused instead on sort of memorializing atrocities exactly where they were committed. So a lot of people killed during the genocide were killed in churches where they were seeking refuge, and many times churches would be sort of turned into these kinds of memorialization projects where quite literally the skulls and body parts of the victims were stacked up to sort of give you a sense of the sort of scale of the atrocities committed during the genocide. And finally, we have what is called sort of local or customary transitional justice processes. Now, these can vary quite a bit from place to place and community to community, which is exactly the point. These are sort of less codified and less sort of cookie cutter across locations. I have two examples up here. Another comes from Rwanda in the early 2000s, where in part to deal with just the massive scale of people who had been accused of committing acts of genocide during the Rwandan genocide, the Rwandan government implemented a program called Gacaca. So they sort of revived and in some ways altered a local style justice process that had existed prior to the genocide in a way to sort of help bring communities together, amongst other things. The other example I have up here is from Uganda in the sort of like mid to late early aughts, I guess is what we're calling it now, where Process is called Mato Oput, or the drinking of the bitter root, and it is a local process in northern Uganda that was at least floated as an idea for how to reintegrate former members of the Lord's Resistance Army, the rebel group that had committed atrocities in northern Uganda, back into their communities. Okay, but all of this sort of description of different transitional justice processes, different mechanisms, is just sort of the surface, right? TJ, as a concept and as a research field, is sort of underpinned by both conceptual and sort of normative philosophical questions that are sort of deeply connected to politics and can themselves influence politics. So what are some of these questions? Well, things like, who faces transitional justice? Is it about just those who've perpetrated atrocities, just the bad guys? Or is it also about sort of those who experienced atrocities, the victims? Like, who's a perpetrator? Who's a victim? What about both? What about neither? What is, like, who should be experiencing transitional justice? There's also the question, when is transitional justice? What do transitions have to do with any of this? Is it, is even the question of transition and transitional justice a useful question anymore? And then perhaps most importantly, and most complicated of all, is why transitional justice? Why implement this at all? And what might be the effects of implementing these different kinds of transitional justice mechanisms when we implement them and where we implement them? Okay, I'm gonna start, instead of starting with this first one, I'm gonna actually start with the second question here. When is transitional justice? Okay, so this can mean sort of the original early version, what I like to think of as the first generation of transitional justice scholarship, focused in particular on transitions. Like, transitions were very important, and it focused on transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, from dictatorship to democracy. The sort of second wave of transitional justice scholarship sort of expanded beyond thinking of just democratic transitions and started thinking about sort of formalized transitions from conflict to peace. And so I have examples of both of these up on the screen right now. This first wave of transitional justice research thinks about transitions like what occurred in Berlin in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and East Germany's transition from dictatorship under the sort of a communist dictatorship at the time to democracy and German reunification shortly thereafter. This is sort of considered a canonical example of transitional justice. The transitional justice implemented in Argentina after the fall of the military junta there that I described earlier is yet another example of this sort of transition from dictatorship to democracy, that kind of when. The transition from conflict to peace that sort of characterizes a lot of this second generation of transitional justice scholarship. A perfect example of this is actually a more recent example and comes from Colombia in 2016 when the Colombian government and the FARC, the primary rebel group in Colombia at the time, signed a peace agreement and ended the longest running civil war in the Western Hemisphere. But in recent years, even the sort of transition part of transitional justice has sort of begun to fall by the wayside. This is what I think of as like the third generation of transitional justice research. And this sort of is the research that has come from scholars beginning to take seriously the idea of sort of what transitional justice might look like in non-transitional contexts. Contexts like right here in the United States in the movement for racial justice, particularly trying to address the kinds of abuses caused by the state against minority communities. Or in places like Canada, where the movement for Indigenous justice has sort of pushed for land back and that as a form of reparation. My own work actually looks, or some of my own work actually sits right at this question of thinking about transitional justice in non-transitional contexts. I look at the effects of thinking about police reform policies here in the United States as a form of transitional justice and explore whether sort of talking about them in that way can actually increase support for the kinds of policies that racial justice advocates might care about. Okay, also explicitly political is going back to question 1 of the politics of transitional justice. Who faces or gets transitional justice? Is transitional justice just for those who've committed atrocities, or is it also for victims? And why does it matter? And I think that this is a perfect example of why this might matter. I think, in this era, maybe this isn't true, but most people in the world, I think, can agree that the trials at Nuremberg against the Nazis in 1945 are transitional justice. I think far fewer people in the world would believe that the Wild Purge in France the same year counts as transitional justice. There are people who may disagree, but they're few and far between. And why does this matter? Well, because determining things like who's a perpetrator and who's a victim can matter a lot for thinking about sort of what people should face or what they should get if we're trying to sort of repair society. Okay, and perhaps the single most important question is actually the third, the why. Why implement transitional justice? And I think that the reason why this is the most important, but also the most controversial, is because, like sort of many aspects of this kind of research, transitional justice advocates have suggested that these kinds of policies can be the sort of end-all, be-all of good things to ensure a peaceful, stable, sort of political and social system in the wake of atrocities. Okay, so why, though? Why transitional justice? Why implement it? What are the big goals? Okay, the first sort of commonly stated goal, big goal, of transitional justice is this goal of breaking with the past. The idea here is that this break with the past is both symbolic and literal. So it captures, on the literal side, changes in policies and institutions from one regime or one kind of political order to another, but also represents sort of a larger cultural shift that is much more sort of symbolic than specific policies or institutional changes. The next commonly sort of stated benefit or goal of implementing transitional justice is that transitional justice supports democracy and contributes to democratic consolidation. And the way that this works, according to transitional justice advocates, is that it helps to sort of, for example, remove bad faith actors from the new political, institutional, and sort of social context that sort of allows for better institution building going forward, right? So if, for example, by implementing lustration policies, we can get rid of people who have proven themselves to not support democratic ends, we can actually build better democratic institutions. Okay, another sort of big justification for transitional justice is that it supports peace, stability, and human rights promotion. And the idea here is that, it basically helps create this sort of new democratic culture, which then sort of at least in theory, the idea is that it takes violence off the table as a kind of option, and in doing so helps to ensure these other kinds of things, peace, stability, human rights promotion. And finally, and in my opinion, perhaps most controversially, the idea is that by implementing transitional justice, it can lead to reconciliation. And the way that it does this, according to advocates, is that it can sort of counter denials of the past. It can sort of expand dialogue between different parties and actors who were sort of have different experiences of this past or current political violence. And it can help to address trauma, both individually, interpersonally, and sort of in a broader social context. But as is the case with all of the sort of democratization and peace-building kind of literatures and discourse, there is very much a sense amongst transitional justice advocates that all good things go together, that implementing all forms of TJ can do all of these good things all at the same time, with very little consideration for sort of trade-offs or consequences. And, the question is that true, right? Is it true that the kinds of mechanisms that, for example, create a break with the past, which is often associated with criminal trials, is that true that that is sort of supporting democracy or promoting reconciliation? Is putting people in jail promoting reconciliation between the people who perpetrated abuses and those who were victimized by them? I mean, this is sort of an open empirical question. People are not sure. And this is one of the things that we as transitional justice scholars and as especially sort of empirical social scientists have spent the better part of the last, 20 years now trying to start to evaluate. So I'm going to give a very quick overview of what the state of that looks like, and then I'll open it up for questions. Okay, so while advocates have argued that all good things go together, we as social scientists are like, well, do they? And the state of the field is such that there's some evidence in both directions. So, can implementing transitional justice actually contribute to these goals that we've just talked about? Well, scholars like James Gibson, for example, who has written one of the big pieces on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, have found that in some instances, for example, implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did in fact contribute to reconciliation in South Africa. But there are caveats to this, that it very much depends on how you define reconciliation. And if we define it as sort of a belief that we should coexist, then yes, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did help to contribute to reconciliation. But if we're looking for anything more than that, there's very little evidence that it has done so. On the sort of other side of the kinds of things that we might want to know if transitional justice mechanisms have helped with are scholars like Kathy Sicking, who have tried to evaluate whether what she calls the justice cascade, the sort of rise in especially criminal trials against those who've committed atrocities, has actually sort of helped with things like democratic quality or the reduction in the commission of human rights abuses going forward. And what essentially we have found is sort of mixed results across cases and contexts and also types of transitions. Okay, but what about hurting it? Can transitional justice actually cause problems? Well, there's actually some research that suggests that yes, transitional justice itself can backfire, in particular, depending on the context. So the two examples that I have up here, one is Gacaca courts in Rwanda. So some of the research on Gacaca in Rwanda has found that while it had sort of positive effects on things like the efficiency of dealing with just the raw number of perpetrators accused of committing acts of genocide, it also had this sort of darker side effects of helping to contribute to a narrative that further propped up what was at the time an early and has since become quite solidified new authoritarian regime in post-genocide Rwanda. Another example comes from Poland, where in, I guess now, like, we're talking like the late teens, 2016, 2015, up until quite recently, their government in Poland was using claims of lustration to essentially alter the makeup of the Polish Supreme Court to ensure that its preferred policies, or the Polish Constitutional Court, well, both, to ensure that its preferred policies were sort of not struck down by these kinds of courts. So these are the sort of dark side impacts of transitional justice. All of which is to say that the answers to the questions about the effects of implementing these kinds of policies are still very much open, and that is sort of what the research on transitional justice at this point is very much focused on. That's all I have for you. I'm actually really looking forward to hearing what your questions are. And I'm happy to talk about any of this, any of my research more specifically. Like, it's really open, whatever you're interested in.
Thank you so much for coming to speak today. I really enjoyed your talk. So my question for you is sort of a two-parter, but I wanted to get your personal view on which, if any, of the 7 types of policy you presented do you think are maybe one of the more effective types of transitional justice? And then also, do you think the benefits of pursuing transitional justice policies outweigh the costs?
Ooh, these are both really good questions. Do I think any of them are better than others? I think that I think all of them can be abused, depending on who's in power. Like, this is why I'm a political scientist. The question of power matters a lot for thinking who's in power and what their aims are matter a lot for thinking about sort of how effective these kinds of policies can be. I don't think any of them are inherently better or worse than others, or more effective at getting the desired outcome than others. If I were to sort of create a better or worse sort of category, I guess I would imagine that the victim-centered TJ projects are better, but they're also much more complicated. Yeah, so that's my sort of better or worse, which I know is like kind of a non-answer, but it really just depends. Because I can think of, for every category here, I can think of places where it got abused in all the bad ways. And your second question was?
Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
Oh, do the benefits outweigh the costs? I am also very agnostic on this question, in part because I'm driven sort of by the results of the research, which very much suggest that there are real costs and real benefits to all of these. I think that a sort of well-designed and executed transitional justice sort of policy approach, the benefits outweigh the costs, but that kind of an approach doesn't happen everywhere, and doesn't, and who's in power matters a lot.
Kind of a follow-up question. I'm curious as to how we might then judge transitional justice processes in a decolonial way also, recognizing that each community should have the power to decide what justice means for them. But I'm curious as to like what your research has shown, what is effective, what works. Is there a model that we can look to for transitional justice?
Is there a model we can look to? So I think that every place is different, and I think that one of the most important things that we as scholars, especially scholars in the West, can do is acknowledge that. And I think that increasingly transitional justice research has had to contend with the results of earlier waves of transitional justice policy, which has essentially taken this one-size-fits-all approach of like, yes, there's a civil war, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to have a truth commission, and there are going to be some criminal trials, and then like everything's going to be fine, and we don't understand why that hasn't happened. And I think increasingly there's been a really serious effort, both in academia and in sort of policy and practice, to try to think through the realities of every situation being different. I think that there are better and worse instances of sort of taking seriously the needs of especially victims' communities in the places where these kinds of atrocities have happened. So, one of the cases that I know the best is Colombia in the wake of the 2016 peace agreement. And while nobody thinks that this agreement as designed is perfect and that the transitional justice provisions in this agreement as designed are perfect, the details of what got negotiated was very much sort of a ground up approach that took into consideration both the preferences of both the like offending parties, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? Like both the government, who committed massive atrocities, and the FARC, who committed massive atrocities, but also really tried to center the needs and claims made by victims. Like the victims of the conflict had a whole separate set of representatives at the peace negotiations who were like given sort of centralized time to give input on what victims wanted. And to me, that is like a good way of trying to think about how to do this. Now, implementation is harder than that, but certainly if we're looking at how to design policy to try to address atrocities that have been committed, something sort of ground up, I think is the best way to go.
Thank you so much for being here. I guess my question is about reparations, specifically in the U.S. For the most part, we know harm has been, or at least people acknowledge that harm has been done, but do you think transitional justice is the right thing to do in the U.S. when the victims that were affected are no longer here, but our descendants are still here?
So, I would contend that there are plenty of victims who are here right now. It's not just the descendants of victims. But so to me, I think this is a yes and, not an either or, in part because by and large, they're the same people. But I think that one of the big debates that I have sort of waded into in the latest strain of my research when thinking about, I think mostly about transitional justice as in the United States, like my work on transitional justice in the United States focuses mostly on addressing contemporary harms. So I spent most of my research on this has focused on transitional justice as racial justice in the context of policing, which is like a very contemporary, police harm is happening right now. But I think that one of the big debates that has happened when thinking about applying the theories and tools of transitional justice to the United States has been exactly this question. But this is not just a US question. It really gets to this question. Who is a victim if what we're going to do is talk about repairing harms done to victims? Who's a victim? This is a question that exists everywhere where victim sort of compensation or reparations occurs. And so I don't think it's a different kind of debate. I just think that, like, we haven't yet figured out how to answer it. And we haven't yet figured out how to answer it in the United States, but, like, it's a hotly contested issue in the places where people have tried to answer it and provide reparations.
Hi, thank you so much. I also realized our entire row is asking questions, so I'll try to make this really quick. My question was, what is the role of transitional justice with regard to people who weren't necessarily bystanders? They were like involved in a lot of the conflicts, but they were involved for fear of persecution by like a larger entity. And like maybe if they were involved in a lot of these trials, they could actually argue that like I wouldn't have actually made the decisions and the choices that I would have made if I wasn't under scrutiny of this larger government. What is the role of transitional justice in those types of cases?
This is a great question. And also a question that doesn't really have an answer, in that, like, how it has been answered or how these kinds of issues have been addressed is very context dependent. By and large, what I will say is that certainly in the sort of criminal trial context, those who commit atrocities, for example, as a member of an armed group or as a member of the military, like the common sort of way that people talk about this is the like following orders thing. Like that has by and large, nobody accepts that as a legitimate justification for committing atrocities. The sort of broader sort of civilian population or like people outside of those contexts who have, you know, for whatever reason, whether it's fear of their lives personally or sort of larger communal considerations, there's been a lot of sort of variation in actually how that's played out in court and across contexts. And like my personal opinions are that is precisely why this is transitional justice too, in my mind, because making the decisions about who transitional justice applies to matters not just in thinking about who gets punished, but also who doesn't and why. So like it really depends across contexts, but this is why, like in my conceptualization and in many people's conceptualizations of what transitional justice entails, it includes amnesty, because amnesty can also mean like people in these kinds of situations may have done bad things, but we've decided that that is worthy of amnesty because of these particular kinds of considerations.
Hi, thank you so much for being here with us today. I think my question is also sort of a who, but it's who enacts transitional justice? Like, does it have to be a group that has enough institutional and structural power to make the sorts of changes that are necessary as a part of that? And does that interfere with what Amelia was saying about how it should really be motivated from the community level? And I guess a part of that too is if it's coming from this sort of empowered place or empowered group, how does it reconcile with the fact that maybe it's the same people who are a part of that group who are the issue? And so at like the state level.
Yeah, this is also a great question and a sort of long-standing one, especially the second part of your question of like, what do you do when like the very people making the decisions about transitional justice may be those sort of like who have perpetrated the atrocities that necessitate transitional justice. And this is part of why that first generation of scholarship focused so much on these stark transitions, because the idea was that like, what do you do with all of these bad people when they're not in power anymore? And you have to figure out how to move on. But those lines have blurred as what we have considered transitional justice to be has like expanded. And when we've sort of taken it out of the very clean-cut contexts, though I would claim that the clean-cut contexts were never actually that clean. I think that this question of who implements it is a really important one, and sort of empirically, there's a lot of variation. I think that many, though not all, transitional justice scholars would suggest that, okay, so the question of what constitutes transitional justice is a huge debate. I think that most TJ scholars would try to at least draw the line at it being something implemented by, I'm gonna say a state, but I don't mean like a body of sufficient authority. So that can include an international institution like the ICC, but it can also include like a national government or a regional government or a local government. But the question of sort of much more grassroots kinds of transitional or efforts that look a lot like transitional justice, like this is where there's a lot of debate, because there are a lot of sort of community, sort of bottom-up grassroots movements, even like in the United States, that are pushing for things that look a lot like transitional justice. But I think that most people would not call them that until there is buy-in by some form of state institution with sufficient authority. But there are people who might debate me on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your amazing lecture. So till now, I do have this feeling it's like there are a lot of debates within this field regarding the definition, where is the implementation, things like that. I'm just curious, like maybe from your perspective as an expert, could you maybe give us like a concrete example of what you think is a, let's say, well-designed transitional justice mechanism that is like the benefit actually surpass the costs?
A well-designed one. I think there are actually lots of instances of well-designed mechanisms across all of the different mechanisms that I laid out. Like one of the things that we as social scientists spend a lot of time doing is like looking at both the positive and the negative impacts of things. So for every mechanism I can tell you is a well-designed one, I can tell you why it's not good enough also. The example that I gave of the mechanism sort of designed during the Colombian peace process, to me, is actually a very well-designed mechanism, in part because it had this victim buy-in, but also it's just like a comprehensive, it includes everything from, there's sort of like a formal criminal aspect to it that has like a lot of nitty-gritty details built into it that I'm happy to talk about because I know them quite well. But also has sort of a truth-telling component to it that helps to establish a set of facts in a place where conspiracy and sort of like questions of who did what have always sort of run rampant, in part because of politics, mostly because of politics, and has a sort of like a reparative component to it as well, amongst other things. And a lot of that is a product of, it's not exclusively, but a lot of it is a product of having sort of this buy-in from victims' organizations. So to me, that's a well-designed one. The reason why I hesitate to make claims about its execution is because it's literally still happening as we're talking right now. So I just like, you can't evaluate. I mean, you can try to evaluate something while it's going on, but like, and there are parts that I think are going very, very well, or much better than expected, and other parts that have maybe sort of had issues.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. My question is, I guess, a little bit more like logistical. I'm wondering, like, as a political scientist, assuming you're working with, I guess, like a cohesive definition of transitional justice, and like starting from that point, how do you, like, what methods do you use, and how do you evaluate like the effectivity of transitional justice in these different like environments?
Yeah, this is a great question as well. So political scientists have tried to evaluate sort of the effectiveness or the sort of different impact that transitional justice has had on these different kinds of goals in a few different ways. So sort of quantitatively, there's been a lot of work, especially if we're talking about how people feel or what people think. There's been a lot of work done just using surveys and interviews. So I have some friends and sort of colleagues in the field in political science who have looked at, for example, the effectiveness of the Chilean Human Rights Museum on like what, when somebody goes there, how do they feel about the dictatorship, and how do they feel about sort of, they talk about it as support for democracy, but what they're actually measuring is like how much do they think, like a person who visits this museum, how much do they think the military should be allowed to intervene in politics? And one of the things that they find is like visiting this museum seems to, even 6 months later, decrease people's willingness to like support the military intervening in politics, even amongst people who have partisan leanings that are more affiliated with the former dictatorship. So that's especially when you're dealing with how people are thinking or feeling, a lot of people use surveys. My work on support for policing in the United States, you can contextualizing it within the like language of transitional justice is survey work on just like, if I asked this room and I framed these kinds of policies as like defund the police or as transitional justice, one of the things that we find is that framing it as transitional justice appears to increase support for implementing the same set of policies. For some of the other kinds of outcomes, there are different ways that people get at this, both just interviewing and talking to people, and quantitatively looking at, there are these sort of large data sets on human rights scores or like raw like instances of political violence. And so if what you care about is support for human rights, or you care about, you know, reducing atrocities going forward as a desired outcome, people will evaluate whether different kinds of transitional justice mechanisms have had those kinds of effects.
So through this program, we've talked a lot about decolonization and legacies of colonialism. And most of the examples given here were domestic, i.e. there was a dictatorship in a country and then it was transitioned to democracy. And so my question is, how can transitional justice be applied to the context of decolonization, especially when the colonial power exists not in the place that is colonized and the power relationship between the two still exists?
This is a great question that I do not have an answer for. So this question of, there are lots of different ways of thinking about decolonization in the context of transitional justice. I think perhaps actually the hardest one to address is the question that you asked, whereas there are sort of other ways of thinking about it that I think are sort of a little bit cleaner, maybe. I don't know if that's the right term I want to use, but cleaner in thinking through how to address it, because of things like thinking about contemporary colonial, like, or neo-colonial power dynamics when it comes to like aid or, you know, funding these kinds of projects. Thinking about buy-in from victims as opposed to everything being top-down or internationally mandated. Those are ways of sort of cleaner ways of thinking about decolonizing transitional justice. But this is in some ways the hardest because the colonial power dynamics still exist, and so how do you hold to account former colonial powers for the sort of like massive atrocities that were and still are committed in the context of colonization? And I just like, I don't know. I wish I had an answer. And like in a lot of ways, like with the these kinds of mechanisms, because they're sort of driven by those in power, like a lot of work has to happen in the metropole to try to address these kinds of things. And I think that kind of work is happening. It's happening slowly and not always like well, but it's happening. And then there's the question of what transitional justice can actually mean. Whether that's like the British Museum returning all the things it's stolen, or like there's nobody to put on trial, or actually in some instances there are, but like transitional justice is going to look different over time, in part because some kinds of mechanisms will no longer apply simply because of time. And so my hope is that as we sort of take seriously these kinds of concerns, we start to think we, in colonial metropoles, try to do more to hold our own governments accountable, and push for this kind of work, because nobody else is going to do it.
Hi, I'm Jules. Thank you for coming here today. I'm wondering how your perspective on how certain mechanisms of transitional justice in non-transitional periods can end up perpetuating the longevity of the specific injustices being committed. An example of this, I think, can be affirmative action that was enacted in 1961, but it didn't stop racism from happening and things like that. It actually, I feel like, let people justify policies that still enabled racism.
Yeah, so like this sort of question of more generally a question of the sort of dark side, the downsides of different kinds of transitional justice mechanisms, I think is really important, because it means that we should be really thinking hard about the implications of the things that we do when we do them. And we see this in contexts that are not just in non-transitional contexts. But I think that one of the things that happens in particularly places where we're dealing with sort of longstanding, both sort of active policy-driven abuses, inequities, et cetera, and the more sort of structural, cultural kinds of abuses, inequities, et cetera, is that you can end up substituting one for the other, or addressing one and then that papering over the other. So I spent some time living in Canada, and one of the things that was talked about a lot is that Canada's had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as it relates to, in particular, the Indigenous boarding schools that committed sort of really terrible atrocities against Indigenous communities. And one of the big criticisms of this was that, there's this sort of view that, sort of like white settlers in Canada are sort of like, oh yeah, well, see, we did this and now everything's better and we should be reconciled. And like none of the larger systemic structural issues have been addressed. And so when I think about that, it's not even sort of the explicit kind of backlash that you might see. It's more of a substitute effect of like, yes, we've done this. So now we've solved racism in Canada and there's no problem. And to me, the solution to that is to be, one, to be conscious of and aware of the dark sides of transitional justice. Because if you pretend that all good things go together all the time, it means that you aren't ready to deal with trade-offs when they come. And then to take that knowledge and take an informed approach to policy design and implementation to try to stave off at least the kinds of bad things we know can happen because we've seen it.
Hi, thank you for coming and for your talk. My question had to do with, I guess, how is the effectiveness of transitional justice affected when some of the perpetrators can't be brought to trial? So I guess I'm thinking, for example, of the trials in Argentina against the military junta. Obviously, those are some of the perpetrators, but there's also the involvement of the U.S., and which is something I feel like has never publicly been acknowledged by the U.S., and I guess how does that affect the victim's ability to move on and receive justice? And is there a future in which you see sort of a more full achievement of justice where like all of these colonial or imperialist, whatever you want to call it, powers can really be brought into these discussions? Because in Rwanda as well, and in so many of the things you mentioned, they were deeply involved.
Yeah, I think that this is a great question. And it actually connects directly to a question that we've kind of danced around but haven't actually spent a ton of time talking about, which is like, what is justice and how do we achieve it? And the reason why I'm sort of bringing that up is in part because not all mechanisms are going to, one of the biggest recognitions of early transitional justice scholarship and practice is that not all mechanisms are going to be possible all the time, and also that they may not all have the same sort of effect everywhere or in every context all the time. Like, I don't know what it would mean to, like which individuals one would want to put on trial for U.S. involvement in propping up the junta and more directly in other things related to Operation Condor in the region. But acknowledgement might be a great place to start, and sort of pushing for acknowledgement that this was something that the United States was involved in. There's been a big effort, and it's been happening, of declassifying documents in the United States related to, in particular, that era. And declassifying documents in sort of Chile and Argentina and Uruguay and elsewhere related to U.S. involvement in that era. And to me, sort of like, this is where things like Truth Commission or Truth Commission-like activities can be really important, because it can help us to even just establish a record of what happened. Like, we all know it, but like, what does it mean to know it if you don't actually have the details to put to the thing we all know? And so, like, is that the same thing as putting somebody on trial? No, but is that justice? Like, I think that's a really important part of it, yeah.
I've already asked a question, so if anybody else hasn't gone but has one, they can ask. But, okay, so I don't know how closely you may have been following the efforts to ratify a new constitution in Chile, but as of last month, they had the second vote for the second constitution, and it fell flat. And with that, Chilean officials kind of decided, we don't want to waste more time and resources and another constitutional convention and have another thing fail. So they're keeping the constitution from the dictatorship of from 1980. And my question regarding this is, this is an example of, if I'm understanding transitional justice correctly, transitional justice that fell flat, and that an effort that really didn't amount to much. And so my question is, how do we move forward after efforts for transitional justice fail while still trying to maintain an effort for justice?
Yeah, I think that, so in any case, this is a great question. In any case, I think that I try to, less so in my research, because that's just like not how political science research works, but more in my own sort of like philosophy on TJ, try to think of it holistically. So there are parts of transitional justice in Chile that have gone very, very well, and parts that have like gone less well. And that's true everywhere. I think that the effort to rewrite the Constitution, so a big part of, for everybody else, a big part of one of the goals of trying to rewrite the Constitution for the dictatorship is to basically get rid of some of the institutionalized advantages that officials like associated with the dictatorship or sort of partisans associated with the dictatorship receive as a result of this constitution that was passed essentially on the way out the door to make sure that they kept these advantages. And so, like, that's a big move. Whereas lots of little moves have been really, really great. Maybe it's just not the time. This is why, so that people used to put sort of temporal, very finite temporal constraints on the time frame in which transitional justice needed to happen for it to be transitional justice. And this third wave of transitional justice research, the kind that I sort of mostly consider myself a member of, part of the reason why that has gone away is because honestly, the biggest motive for that to have gone away was the fact that like that pact of forgetting in Spain like started to break down like 40 years later. And people like especially in the last decade, there's been a big move to try to actually address some of the legacies of the Spanish Civil War and the Franco dictatorship. And so I'm like, maybe it's just not time yet, but that doesn't mean it will never be time. I have hope. Yeah, so I think of it as sort of holistically, there can be wins and losses if what we're thinking about is justice in a holistic fashion. And so, like lots has changed in Chile since the 80s. And so maybe this is not the moment for a constitutional change, but it doesn't mean that lots of other things haven't been much, much better.
So nice to end on message.
Thank you. I'll also say that given what I study, it is rare that we end on a message of hope. So I'm like, hey.